Does anyone really use them? Is this just some sort of like big amusement park ride? I think Europeans ride them. That would make sense. Today's episode is inclined railways, also known as inclined planes, and known to our European friends as funiculars. Finally, some mention of Mother Europa on this horrible Americentric channel. God save the Queen, make her pay attention to us. To save some syllables, I'm going to just call them inclines for the rest of the episode. Inclines are typically short, traveling between two stations separated by a large vertical distance. Their tracks are extremely steep, too steep for traditional railways to climb. Railways we typically think of are called adhesion railways. The rail vehicles supply power to turn a wheel. The friction between the wheel and a steel rail holds the vehicle down and moves it forward. Steel wheels on rails have relatively low friction, and so the maximum slope for adhesion railways is about a 10% grade. Most railroads, though, are never steeper than about a 3% grade. Inclines overcome this issue by hauling rail vehicles with a steel cable called a haul rope. The haul rope is connected to a rail car and then usually wrapped around what is called a bull wheel, the same as the big wheel on the end of a ski lift. And then the other end of the haul rope is connected to another car. Cars counterbalance each other for efficiency, using the energy from the upper car's descent to lift the lower car. This counterbalancing is important. If the cars do not counterbalance and can move independently of each other, our inclined friend is no longer an inclined railway. It is an inclined elevator. Inclined elevators are one of two types of transit commonly confused with inclined railways. The other is cog railways, and we're starting to get into railroad esoterica. Cog railways are also visually similar to inclines. They travel up steep slopes. Their mechanics are different though. Rail vehicles supply their own power, which is used to turn a gear, a cog, that runs along a toothed rack rail. This holds the vehicle onto the tracks on steep slopes. The earliest inclines were mechanically simple. Cars were moved by adding ballast to the descending car. Ballast usually came in the form of ore being removed from a mine, water along a canal, or, something our Swiss friends thought up, city sewage. Later inclines were powered using a steam engine and then electric motors. The earliest inclines were also arranged with two parallel tracks, one for each car. Two full tracks aren't really necessary for inclines though. The cars will never occupy the same section of track at the same time except for passing. Smaller solutions are three rail systems where two tracks share a center rail with a small space for passing. Then there are single track systems where cars share a track except for a two-track passing area in the center. There aren't many inclines in the United States, and the few we have sort of operate in a gray area between transit and tourism. I was able to count 5 inclines that serve as some form of transit. Angel's Flight Railway in Los Angeles, the Fenelon Place Elevator in Dubuque, Iowa, 2 inclines in Pittsburgh, the Duquesne and Monongahela inclines, and my queen, the love of my life, the apple of my eye, the Johnstown Inclined Plane in Johnstown, Pennsylvania. So besides that, there is a tourist incline in Chattanooga, Tennessee, a handful of inclines in amusement parks, 2 almost unknown inclines for private residences in San Francisco, and a handful scattered across resort properties and golf courses, and that's it. That's all of them. That's all there is. I love these little weirdos. I can't really explain it. They just scratch some sort of itch. Like, I probably spend a solid hour each day thinking about just the Johnstown inclined plane. It's so cool they called it an inclined plane. It's crazy how this little mountain town has one of so few left. Anyway, let's see what a typical incline is like. Passenger inclines in the United States can be attributed almost entirely to two men. John Indris was a Prussian engineer who had worked in mines in Prussia where inclines, funiculars, were commonly used to move ore. In 1866, he immigrated to Cincinnati and met a Hungarian engineer named Samuel Diescher. Diescher had experience with mining inclines as well. The two, along with Caroline Indris, John Indris's daughter and first female engineer in the United States, designed the first passenger incline in the United States in 1870, the Monongahela Incline. Indris designed a few more inclines before his death in 1889. Diescher and Caroline Indris, who may have actually been John Indris's sister, but the 1800s are kind of just like that, got married in 1872. Diescher is credited with designing the majority of passenger inclines built during the remainder of the century in what became an incline boom in the United States, our Liftomania, so to speak. Inclines were usually built for one out of a handful of reasons. First was freight. Funiculars were developed in Europe for mining, and they continued this function in the United States. Second was to connect to some sort of tourist destination, a resort, an amusement park, or just a scenic overlook. Third is the urban transit side of things. Here, two cities stand out, Cincinnati and Pittsburgh. In Cincinnati, 5 inclines were built, famous for carrying the city's streetcars. I love these pictures of streetcars on the inclines. It's such just like a beautiful mid-century picture. In Pittsburgh, 17 inclines were built. Remember back in modern streetcars, I said there's always one city that absolutely blows the others away. That's something we're going to see a lot when we're looking at categories of transit system, is that often there's just one example that works absolutely amazingly and blows all the others out of the water. Well, here, that's Pittsburgh. A combination of geography and industry brought about Pittsburgh's incline dominance. Coal mining was carried out on a ridge near the city, Mount Washington, and freight inclines were built to haul the coal out. To build housing for immigrant laborers, passenger inclines were built parallel to the freight inclines. But before I get too far ahead of myself, let's save a little bit of this story and we'll tell it through our own incline. Before we start, I've had a lot of new followers to the channel in the last month, so I'm going to reintroduce what exactly it is we do around here. Each episode centers around a single type of transit, usually distinct to a single era, like streetcars in the 2010s and metros in the 1970s and 80s. To tell that story, I use this city I put together in the game, City Skylines, called Washburn. Washburn is sort of a prototypical American city. The vibes are mostly Midwestern, but it could be easily transferable to a lot of different areas. In each episode, I drop in a new form of transit into the city and tell its story. That includes the history of the transit in our own little universe, how it fits into the rest of the United States, effects, and usually why that type of transit has fallen out of favor. Washburn's Incline is the Hilltop Inclined Railway, connecting the community of Hilltop to the city. It is 787 feet long, and it climbs a 240-foot high hill with 2 parallel tracks and 2 incline cars. In the late 1890s, housing and labor shortages had put the squeeze on one of Washburn's largest industries, the Caledonia Iron Company. To deal with this, the company turned to land it owned on a hill adjacent to Washburn and near their own Caledonia Iron Works. The hill had been mined for some time, but it was sparsely settled. Long dirt switchback trails made reaching the summit difficult. Hearing of the inclines that had become popular in nearby cities like Pittsburgh and Cincinnati, Caledonia Iron commissioned an incline to connect the top of the hill to the company ironworks. This opened as the Caledonia Inclined Railway in 1894. The incline served passengers and some company freight and allowed the company to develop its land at the top of the hill. Like the streetcar suburbs we looked at in History of Streetcars, many inclines were built as real estate development devices. Hilly cities were surrounded by land that was extremely close to dense areas, but difficult travel kept it inaccessible. Building an incline could make acres of cheap land extremely valuable. This is Washburn's situation. It's adjacent to the Appalachian foothills, and so there are several hills near the edge of the city. Caledonia Iron Company took on its role as a real estate developer and subdivided the land into residential lots that it then sold to immigrant workers who would take the incline to their jobs at the ironworks. Many of the immigrant laborers recruited by industrial cities in the Midwest were German and familiar with the mining inclines called Steilbahns. Steilbahn directly translates to sloped train, which sounds like a typical literal compound German word, but honestly, inclined railway is too. It's just a railway that's inclined up from horizontal, and an inclined elevator is just an elevator that's inclined down from vertical, which means an inclined railway is like a train on hard mode, and an inclined elevator is an elevator on easy mode, and that is why we stand inclined railways and not inclined elevators. After all the lots were sold, the incline was spun off into its own subsidiary, the Caledonia Inclined Railway Company. The population of Hilltop exploded as it became an early residential suburb. The community formed into the borough of Hilltop with its own borough government, and it was predominantly occupied by ironworkers that commuted down the hill each day, paying a nickel to the company each way, and doing 8 solid hours smelting iron. Things continued this way for a handful of decades. When Caledonia Iron was bought by the larger Gethsemane Steel Company in 1923, not much changed beyond the name on the plant. In 1937, however, Gethsemane wanted to rid itself of the incline. Transit that is built to facilitate a greater purpose, like selling residential properties, connecting to a hotel or amusement park, tended to be the transit that disappeared earliest. In general, the transit operation itself was not profitable, but could be sustained by profits made elsewhere that benefited from the transit. Once the reason that the transit was built ceased to exist, or the transit was removed from the earnings derived elsewhere from its utility, like it's spun off into its own company, it quickly becomes a financial burden. An aging incline, with its fare stuck at a municipally mandated 5 cents, and some residents already choosing to buy their own cars, was a liability that Gethsemane Steel wanted to rid itself of. The incline was sold to the borough of Hilltop for $1. The borough continued operating it, renaming it to the Hilltop Inclined Railway. Road access to Hilltop improved in the post-war era, and a new threat to the incline emerged. The Washburn Transit Company now equipped with rubber-tired buses that could handle grades that streetcars could not, extended a bus route up to Hilltop and began poaching riders from the Incline. Riding the bus down from the mountaintop was longer and required more stops than the Incline, but it brought riders into the heart of the city and provided many more stops and other transfers along the way. This was one of the struggles that all inclines faced. Although they may have been the fastest way down the hill, most riders need to go farther than that, and if you're going to have to transfer to a city bus eventually, you might as well take one the whole way. Job decentralization continued to make the bus and driving more appealing options than the Incline. Through the 1950s, the steel plant went through periods of downsizing, and many residents of Hilltop no longer worked exclusively in the factories at the foot of their hill. In 1962, the borough of Hilltop was annexed into Washburn. The borough had been struggling financially as residents' employment at the steel mill was unstable and businesses in the community began to close. As part of the annexation, the Hilltop Inclined Railway was transferred to the Washburn Tourism Board, refurbished, and reopened with the intent to attract tourists to ride up and take in the city vista. 6 years later, in 1968, the Incline transferred ownership once more to the newly formed Washburn Area Rapid Transit Agency. From this point forward, it occupies a sort of dubious space between amusement and transit. Some residents still commute to jobs using the Incline, but a large share of riders are also tourists going up just to take in the view. This is the space that pretty much all surviving inclines occupy. For residents of neighborhoods that the inclines reside in, they can be a useful piece of transit infrastructure. That utility, though, is often reliant on how well integrated the inclines are into the city's greater transit system. Inclines that were primarily built as transit, like the Johnstown Inclined Plane, Duquesne Incline, and Monongahela Incline, have connecting bus services. The Duquesne Incline and Monongahela Incline also have fare integration into Pittsburgh's transit system. Likewise, the Angels Flight Railway in Los Angeles has fare integration with the LA Metro. Despite fare integration, though, Angels Flight doesn't seem like it has much of a future as real transit. It is only a block long, and there's a staircase that runs alongside it. The Fenelon Place elevator in Dubuque, Iowa, is in a similar position. The Incline, it is an incline. It's not an elevator. See, you can see the cables connecting the cars and the little passing area. It costs $1.50 each way and only runs between April and November. You can walk from the base of the hill to the summit in about 8 minutes according to Google Maps, although it is still up quite a hill. These smaller inclines will probably always struggle to ascend beyond their novelty status. Modern transit systems generally do not plan in a way that has potential for future inclines. When new transit is developed, routes are drawn with a much more regional view, and the hyper-local point-to-point nature of inclines doesn't really fit into that. There's very few examples of new transit being used to overcome a specific geographic barrier, and where they do exist, it's pretty much exclusively gondolas, and I'll do an episode on that. I think the very local scale that inclines have is part of what makes them so interesting to me. This whole little railway is built to move people across such a small area, and they're so tucked back into quiet neighborhoods too that if you couldn't see the tracks rising up the mountainside, you would hardly know what the little stations even are. The only future for inclines right now seems to be in their smaller cousin, the inclined elevator. A handful of inclined elevators have been built across the United States in the last decades. They even have a niche in transit. A few newer transit stations have inclined elevators installed to reach their platforms. City Place Uptown Dart Station in Dallas, 34th Street Hudson Yards in New York, and Huntington Metro Station in Washington, D.C. all use inclined elevators to access some part of the station. As for our beautiful counterbalanced inclines, though, their time seems to have passed. In the United States, at least. Funiculars in Asia and Europe received more regular upkeep and renovation. You can see some of their more modern transit vehicles here. So as much as I'd like to see inclines rise again, in the US, the future of inclines probably remains as historic relics that are sort of transit and sort of also an attraction. Okay, what to plug at the end here? I put out a bonus episode recently. It's about Amtrak's Standard Stations program. You can watch the trailer for it. I'll put the link below. If you want the whole thing, become a patron on Patreon at the $2 tier, and you'll get the link. Patreon is down below. Other benefits include your name in the credits here in a second, and I do some exclusive posts from time to time. Besides that, follow me on Twitter at Big Mood Energy. Like, subscribe, smash the bell, and watch again.